Good afternoon and welcome to your lecture on Paper 2, Module 3, Feminist Articulations. I am Professor Sarvajit Mukherjee from the Department of English, University of Allahabad. Writing by women must be regarded as a major development in women's empowerment. Given the fact that let alone education, the acquisition of basic literacy has been a hard-won achievement even for men, the odds against women getting educated enough to express themselves have been great. It is interesting to speculate who the first women must have been who took the trouble to get educated, but no doubt this must have been a major step of subversion. There are enough examples from India to show how great the struggle for education was for women. Hymns composed by women in the Vedas and the writings of Buddhist nuns notwithstanding. However, the dawn of feminist consciousness in the West was the result of writing by educated and informed women, as is well documented. Mary Wollstonecraft, dates 1759 to 1797, is regarded as the most important foremother of Western feminism. Wollstonecraft focused on women's education. She justified the education of women that it would help women fulfill their social roles as wife and mother. Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Women is considered to be the first text of Western feminism. The French Revolution had thrown up the idea of the rights of man. As feminists have pointed out, the word man presumes the automatic inclusion of women. That this is not so was first suggested by Wollstonecraft's title. Motivated by Enlightenment values, Wollstonecraft advocated that rationality and reason be given precedence over sensibility and emotions in women. According to Wollstonecraft, this would be possible only if women were educated. She insisted that a woman must be educated so as to be able to perform her social duty as wife and mother efficiently. Women were the first teachers of their children and therefore needed to be educated. Education would also ensure that women were companions for their husbands, not mere chattels. It is interesting to note that similar arguments were advanced in favor of educating women by the reformists in India in the 19th century. Mary Wollstonecraft had the courage to challenge the ideas of Rousseau, current in the 18th century, that women did not need an education, were irrational and emotional creatures, and best remained so. In America, Margaret Fuller, eminent journalist and editor, also emphasized the education of women, but in order to help women opt for other roles than purely domestic ones. Margaret Fuller parallels the achievements of Mary Wollstonecraft in the USA. Fuller's Woman in the 19th Century, published in 1845, is a powerful treatise on the emancipation of women. Fuller stresses education, employment, and political rights for women. Unlike Wollstonecraft, Fuller does not champion education for women to make them better wives and mothers. Rather, education is important for a woman because it makes her employable and gives her other roles than purely domestic ones. Anticipating Virginia Woolf's views by nearly a century, Fuller advocates androgyny. According to her, there is nothing like a complete male or complete female. Rather, each gender has some elements of the other. Fuller also brought an abiding spiritual commitment into her writings. She was concerned with the unequal relations between the classes and between the blacks and the whites in America. She also worked for prison reforms and the lot of women prisoners. However, the contribution of both Wollstonecraft and Fuller were supposed to have reached their logical conclusion by the beginning of the 20th century, it being widely presumed that women had achieved all that they were struggling for by the 1920s. That this was a misconception was proven by Virginia Woolf. Virginia Woolf focuses on issues of authorship and androgyny besides education. She spells out the difficulties encountered by a woman writer and suggests a new approach to literature, one that does not reject the domestic as trivial. She also suggested adopting a language that is women-specific. Virginia Woolf was born into an eminent Victorian family and belonged to the class that should have reaped the maximum benefit of the women's struggle for empowerment in the previous century. In her writings, Virginia Woolf proves that even women from affluent and educated families suffer under multiple oppressions. Virginia Woolf was the first feminist writer to concern herself with authorship, and in two epoch-marking essays, namely A Room of One's Own, published in 1929, and The Three Guineas, published in 1938, she explores the question of women's writing. Woolf indicates how difficult it is for a woman to write. She must have the time, the financial resources, and education before she can hope to write at all. If she does manage to write despite these handicaps, she must then face the mighty publishing establishment which is dominated by men. Even when a woman writer is popular and has a wide readership, her writing is dismissed by editors, publishers, and critics as trivial and unimportant. So it is very difficult for a woman writer to become part of the canon. If it is important for a writer to live before she can produce great literature, is this possible for a woman who would then face social disadvantage? To prove her point, Woolf imagines a character, Shakespeare's sister, Judith Shakespeare. Had Judith Shakespeare's life paralleled that of William Shakespeare, would she have been considered artist or whore? Women write about the domestic, says Woolf, because their experience lies within the domestic. What is required is a total change in attitude, a change which privileges the everyday and the domestic over the grandiloquent and the exaggerated. Woolf dismisses the idea of male and female writing. She talks about the androgynous mind. The creative mind is neither male nor female, but a combination of the two. Woolf's engagement with authorship puts her in a class of her own, which beyond other feminist thinkers of her age. While sundry other theories deal with the problem of representation in literature with lofty disdain, claiming it is all lies, feminism has largely adhered to the position that the representation of women in literature reflects the actual condition of women. Literature both duplicates and parallels the lived material conditions of women. What is more, literature often provides the norm by which to judge the ideal of femininity or masculinity. Our ideas of what a woman or man should be or is like, among other things, is dictated to us by what we read. Feminists accept the conventions of literary realism and view literary representations of women's experience against which to measure the actual reality. One of the first projects of feminism then was to uncover how women are depicted in the literature written by men, androtexts. Many studies were dedicated to the images of women research, it was found that most of these images were reductive and revolved round the whore-Madonna complex. Women were either seductresses or mother figures in these works, and women characters appeared only in those roles in which they appear in the life of a man. Besides, the double standard was shamelessly peddled. What was right and acceptable for a man was definitely a no-no for a woman. This approach, termed phallocentric criticism, was initiated by Simone de Beauvoir. In her book, The Second Sex, even though Mary Wollstonecraft had discussed writers like Milton, Pope, and Rousseau in her book, Beauvoir argued that all literature reflects the social ideas about the roles of men and women. Beauvoir's major contribution to feminist thought is that she posited that a woman is constructed along the lines of what society considers to be appropriate feminine characteristics. In this process of socialization, the representation of women in literature is a major contributor, since it provides role models. Simone de Beauvoir unpacks the ideology of literature. She shows how cultures construct the woman as the other. The idea of gender as construct emerges from this point in feminism. The next major theorist is Kate Millett, dates 1934 to 2017. Millett's Sexual Politics, published in 1969, explored the field further. Millett's premise was that patriarchal society works to preserve male supremacy in a number of ways. Society and culture function to encourage women to internalize ideas of their own inferiority. Literature is deeply complicit in imposing this. Millett examined the work of celebrated English novelist D.H. Lawrence and showed how it is a sustained panegyric to male sexuality. Millett did not suggest that male writers were deliberately denigrating female characters. Rather, unconsciously accepted attitudes found unwitting expression in their writing. Feminist writers also pointed out the frequency with which women characters associated with sexuality or lust were punished in the writings of male authors. Germaine Greer's text, The Female Eunuch, published 1970, follows this approach. This classic text of second-wave feminism effectively challenges the practice of the canon. As stated earlier, the writing of women was mostly condemned as trivial and then marginalized. The canon of literature is and was dominated by male writing. If women authors were not to be read, no challenge to the traditional practice of reading like a man could ever emerge. Elaine Showalter, the founder of gynocritics, established women's writing as a separate category with its own themes, motifs, and language. Elaine Showalter is perhaps the most important critic who established women's writing as a serious literary endeavor. Her book, A Literature of Their Own, published in 1977, not only reassessed canonical women writers, but also seriously studied writers hitherto unknown. To Showalter goes the credit of dividing women's writing into three distinct phases, namely the female, the feminist, and the feminine, to make sense of the newly recovered women's writing. During the feminine stage, women writers emulated male writers. In the feminist stage, they were fiercely radical, while in the female stage, the woman writer tries to reclaim the entire culture of women. This division makes coherent the vast body of women's writing. Showalter coined the term gynocriticism and suggested that women not only wrote differently but should be read differently. Women's writings, wrote Showalter, had its own characteristics, pattern, and identity. Judith Fetterley is an important theorist in the matter of women's writing. Novels written by men required the reader, whatever his or her sex, to read like a man. That is, identify with the author's masculine point of view. This was then grandly declared to be the universality of literature. Judith Fetterley therefore suggests becoming a resisting reader, that is, one who resists the imposition of the male point of view in their reading. The next wave of criticism was images of women criticism. This rereads literature written by men and discovers reductive stereotypes. Androtexts, or texts written by men, were analyzed by Kate Millett, who formulated the idea that women are present in androtexts in only those relationships in which they impinge on the life of a man. Relationships like mother-daughter or between sisters does not exist in these texts. The next project was to discover a women's literary tradition. Feminism rediscovers a lost and suppressed tradition of women's writing. The writings of Aphra Behn, Clara Reeve, Maria Edgeworth, and Elizabeth Barrett were rediscovered and critically analyzed. These women writers, though very popular in their own time, were later dismissed as trivial and domestic by the male-dominated literary establishment. One of the major achievements of feminist criticism has been to rediscover these women authors and also to establish black women's writing. A project dear to the French feminists is the search for a woman's language. The search for woman's language begins with Virginia Woolf, who articulated her discomfort with male language. She used the stream of consciousness technique to subvert the order of language. The French feminists are credited with making feminist theory more sophisticated and borrowing insights from psychoanalysis and structuralism. The French feminists explored various aspects of écriture féminine or women's writing. Discussed by gynocritics like Showalter, Millett, and Ellman, the search for a woman's language found its final advocate in the French feminists Iraigre, Kristeva, and Sixou, who focus on a different woman's language. They posit Cora to be the foundation of a woman's language. Thank you.